Hi, I'm Alicia Fogden and welcome to the latest edition of Stock Journal's Farm Forum. Today we're looking at the grain industry and we're here with GPSA Chairman, Grain Producers SA Chairman Wade Dabenett, Rural Directions Chris Hinges and Rabobank's James Robinson. Can you maybe tell us a bit about yourself and some of your involvement in the industry at the moment?
Yep, so obviously Wade Dabenett, a farmer from Parilla, a farmer with my brother and his wife and my mother and father. We grow potatoes, grain and livestock, and for the last 4 years I've been involved with Grain Producers SA, first as a director, then the vice chair and now the current chairman.
Mm-hmm. Chris?
Yes, Director of Rural Directions, private consulting company. We do a lot of work within the grains industry around risk and risk management and education from a client's point of view. We also have a farm in the lower mid-north.
Look, I've been with the bank 28 years. The last 17 of that has been in South Australia as the state manager, and now I'm the head of relationship management with the bank. And we've got a big area which covers grain, West Coast, Eyre Peninsula, Mid-North, EP, YP, upper southeast, everywhere from a grain point of view, but we also work into the pastoral zone for cattle and sheep in northern South Australia, southern NT, and then western New South Wales. So it's a pretty diverse region from a commodity mix, but grain's the dominant one.
All right, so if we want to take a look locally at the grain industry, do you guys want to give us a little bit of a perspective as farmers and as also industry representatives of how you've seen the season pan out so far and what you guys have been up to with the season so far?
Yeah, so we're where we are in the Southern Mallee, we've probably been some of the more fortunate farmers in terms of rainfall than if you look across the rest of the state. The southeast largely the same as us. So we've had above average rainfall for April, May, July and now August has been exceptional. June was quite dry. I think we only had a couple millimetres. Across the rest of the state, it was dry through June and July. We've probably at this point in time got more potential than what we did have this time last year. We're always heavily relying on September rainfall, and there's always a frost factor where we are, which we've got, I think, a string of them coming this week. So we'll see what happens there. But 60 millimetres of rainfall for us in August is just sensational. So we've had to battle mice like a lot of people have. They've become a big factor in our current farming systems. I'm sure they would prefer mice than dust storms in Adelaide that we had 20 years ago, but we've got to work on how to manage them. So while we run livestock, we don't typically run a lot of livestock over our grain paddocks. So those with livestock and have grazed, it's probably lessened the impact. One of our worst paddocks was canola, in which we lost a third of it, and then it sort of tapered back from there. So I know there's been some real shockers in the mid-north where, Chris could probably talk about some resowing that occurred, so that means crops are later. We haven't had to do that, so we've just had to, bait a lot. We don't have a lot of options to manage them, so, there's only really one bait option, and this year, it wasn't, people are questioning how effective it was, so that's probably been our biggest issue to manage. Other than that, we've had great seasonal conditions for nutrition with the crops, but it's all down to the finish. So price-wise, it's always a challenge to make sure you've got the discipline to manage that appropriately. We've had good opportunities for forward sales. Whether we've done enough, I don't know. Where things lead from here is down to spring rain and the market.
What did you do with those crops, the canola crops that didn't?
It was patchy because the nature of our farms is that it's variable soil types. So where there was heavy stubble load and a little bit of sandy soil, it just got decimated by mice, and yet some of the heavier ground was not so bad. So it's not really like a whole blanket across a paddock that we can go and resow. So we just left it. We'll zone those areas out in the spring and then go manage them for weed control and try and keep those areas clean the best we can. So where other areas I just had complete paddocks wiped out and resowed them. So, but canola is looking sensational. That's a third of our program this year. We've seen a swing back into canola, but nowhere near as much as what we saw back in 10-11. A lot of people have opted for pulses, and which Chris can talk about.
Chris, you want to give an update?
Look, I've just travelled extensively in the last 2 weeks through the state, working with clients from the far west coast right through to the southeast in the Mallee, mid-north and Yorke Peninsula. The way I'd read the crops at the moment is, we've got very much a mixed bag. We've got some crops that are that I would call 8 weeks behind where they would normally be, particularly on parts of the Eyre Peninsula. If you were in early June or late May, you would say the plant counts are there and the tillers are there. What we're talking about as far as what we've got on the spring is certainly really critical for those crops, and those crops actually might get out of jail with a good spring. Everyone's really nervous about the potential for a hot north wind as we sort of get out of the winter and into the spring. So we've got a very varied crop. We've got pulses are probably hanging on as good as I've seen them. Beans are probably back a little bit from what I've seen travelling around. Canola is very variable. We've got lots of variation within crops from far west coast where I've got them in full flower and coke can height to crops in the southeast and the mid north and actually around Pinaroo, which is some of the better crops I've seen. Where they're in full flower and just starting to get that potting cycle. Where we are at Freeling, our crops, we were lucky at the beginning of the season and certainly got our crops out of the ground, and that's been the answer this year. If you had your crops out of the ground at an early stage, now whether it was management or moisture or time of sowing or equipment and tillage, this sort of season where we've had a reasonably late break has actually really showed up in the paddock. And so we've got a lot of variation, and we'll see what September brings us, and that will determine how big the crop is in South Australia.
Is mice of equal a problem?
Mice is of concern because we're not seeing the numbers reduce over winter, which is normally what we would see. And so a lot of the agronomists are actually reporting mice damage in canola and in early heading in wheat and barley crops where the mice are just taking the sweet node and not being selective, they're just going for the sweet spot and dropping the head on the ground. It's something that people are going to have to monitor. It's a bit like all your other agronomic in paddock issues. You have to monitor it and manage, and work for the best result that's sort of a yield, what's going to maximise our yield at the end of the day.
Because there are concerns that there probably are too many numbers about at the moment. Is that something that people are going to need to manage or look to get bait together if they haven't already to maybe prepare before the onslaught of when it gets warmer?
Yeah, I think there's always an issue around baits and cost of baits and effectiveness in the baits. If we don't see the populations drop over the winter where you would normally do, then obviously you have a bigger population you would normally have at the start of spring, and then obviously when numbers start to increase, you're increasing from a bigger base. It causes significant risk, into our crop development stage.
Certainly, probably a plug to the work GPSA did in this area about 5 years ago, after the last mouse plague. Bait has come down considerably because of increased mixing stations and those sort of things. So hopefully that helps farmers in terms of it's greatly reduced the costs. I mean, sometimes it's I think it's a quarter of what it was. And so it's just as Chris said, it's about monitoring and we've sort of been around our paddocks and there's certainly activity. There was alarmingly we thought it was a reasonably cold winter. It had a string of frosts, but it didn't seem to slow them down. There was still activity in the middle of winter, so we know it's going to be a problem in spring. It's all about planning, isn't it? It's no different to nutrition on your crops. You plan to do it, you monitor it, and you apply it when it's needed. And bait is the same.
Mm-hmm. And then what about any other pests that are sort of floating about that have so far? Obviously, green peach aphid's been talked about, and Russian wheat aphid. Has the recent cold weather been able to minimise that damage, or people have gotten onto it because they've been able to recognise it a lot quicker?
Well, for us, we found green peach aphid in one of our canola crops, and that was probably carried over from a horty crop that was near us. So, we had to spray that. Other than that, we haven't had any other incursions. Russian wheat aphid, again, it targets crops that are struggling. So that's probably the big unknown factor in Australia at the moment is we haven't, really, if we have a really tight spring and we've got later sown crops, if they're going to be struggling, that's when Russian wheat aphid will have an impact. But at this stage, some trial sites are showing that the crops will grow out of it. So it's an unknown. But look, there's a wall of research happening in terms of Russian wheat aphid, so I think we'll be a lot wiser. But it's just another thing you have to monitor.
And in that mid-north area?
Oh, look, I think it's a monitoring thing. People are well aware of that as now being in crop, and it's probably no different if I'm on the Yorke Peninsula. I've got snail management, I've got all sorts of other management that becomes just part and parcel of our day-to-day management and our day-to-day agronomy within crops.
Have you seen much mismanagement in the way people have baited or sprayed that maybe advising to watch out for, that maybe they change their management slightly to improve effectiveness?
Oh, there's always there's a push and pull of timeliness versus weather versus efficiency versus effectiveness, and people are always monitoring that. The key thing is talk to your agronomists, talk to people who are there to help, and get your timing right. Do as much as you can to improve your own skill base. Go to your field days, ask questions, and seek sources from a wide area. It's not something to be paranoid about. It's something to be planned for and managed. Just the same as we manage machinery, we manage all sorts of other things. It's just an issue to be managed.
Now, Chris and James, I guess, James, from an overseas perspective, how are seasons panning out in other countries, and how is that possibly having an effect here or something that we need to be watching in Australia?
It's a mixed story on production from mainly the Northern Hemisphere producing countries. Severe droughts through Canada and US is going to see a reduction in production there. But on the other end, in Australia as well, from that point of view, so that's the world stock. But then you look at what's... Russia's going to have another big crop. It's a second big crop back year on year. Argentina's going to have a good crop, and Kazakhstan will have a good crop as well. So they will outweigh the loss in production of America and Australia. So we'll probably see a 2% reduction on this year from last year in total production, but that is still 4% up on the 5-year average. So we're still going to have a high level of wheat stocks globally, which is going to keep prices reasonably soft for this season. So.
There's no barriers or threats in those better producing countries so that we can see happening?
One of the issues that Australia's going to have to be mindful of is that where this extra production is coming from is from low-cost producing nations like Russia, Argentina, Kazakhstan. So they can afford to take a cheaper price when they sell. So, I think Russia, for example, is about 40% lower cost of production for producing a tonne of wheat than what Australia is. And then they also have lower cost supply chain charges because they're closer to their countries they export to. So for them, they can take a lower price but still have a profitable price. So that's one of the challenges for Australia, the Americas and the Canadas, who are higher cost producing countries. So it is about trying to keep cost out of the farmer's business so that they can be more competitive.
Chris, have you seen anything yourself?
Oh, look, I've just recently completed a study tour in Canada, looking at farming country in Saskatchewan and Alberta, which was right in the centre of those sort of dry areas. It was 35 degrees when I was there. The Canadian crop is harvesting at the moment, and probably the big thing is they're harvesting lentils now, particularly, and that lentil market is, which is a very important market from an income point of view from Australian producers. Their yields are down, so that's consistent with what we're seeing. The big frustration is we're actually seeing information that is normally positive to pricing. coming into the market and then being discounted largely, and we're now sort of back to numbers that are below the last 12 months we've had as far as pricing is concerned. So we're seeing lots of volatility in pricing, and that's actually causing anxiety at a farm level. But at the same time, when prices were higher, our season wasn't as good as where we are at the moment. So in line with the rain and our season improving in various areas, we've actually seen pricing coming back in line with that. So one's sort of offsetting the other at the moment.
Is there any crops in particular that are either doing better or worse than another?
As far as agronomic, or
in terms of pricing because of those overseas effects?
It's a mixed bag, and I think things like barley's probably holding up better than a feed barley at $2.15 Adelaide Lincoln versus an ASW wheat, which is going to come in around $2.20. That feed barley number is certainly holding at a better number, and that's probably reflecting also the lower production. The other thing to fit into the overall global sense is actually the stocks that are there are they actually going to be available for market? And so you sort of see this sort of Mexican standoff between the buyers and the sellers. And that's applicable, for wheat and also for lentils particularly.
Being such a large lentil growing region, then that's only going to bode well if the country's not doing so well for...
Well, at the end of the day, farmers, like in any business, will need to actually manage our cash flow requirements. And that becomes the key determinant for selling and pricing grain. You can't sit out of the market for a longer period that you can remain financial. And so cash flow generally will drive some decision making, and that's a global phenomenon. So at the moment we're hearing reports of Russian farmers holding stock because of our wheat stock because it's actually too cheap. But at some point in time, they need the income just as much as anyone else, and so then they start to liquidate stocks. And when they start to liquidate stocks, the buyers will buy. And we do the little dance around pricing and supply and demand. So yes.
Do you see them holding out then till our harvest, making it a difficult time for us?
Oh, look, you've got to overlay the fact that logistics starts to slow down in the Northern Hemisphere as we go towards their winter. And it gets harder to execute, particularly through the Black Sea and out through sort of eastern Canada. It gets a lot harder to execute business, and so that is a problem, or it's an opportunity from us, but it creates a narrow window from our point of view as far as our pricing is concerned, versus long hold strategies versus cash flow. So the business comes first. Understand the requirements of your own business, understand your cash flow requirements, understand your risk profiles, and that's your primary objective. Trying to pick markets at the moment, it's I bid you well with your crusade.
Well then, Wade, how has that affected your decision making in how you plan
Well,
to
I think
market?
the positive thing for us is that there's strong demand in China for our barley, and we predominantly grow 30% barley, 30% canola, and we're 20% wheat. So and you talk to some farmers in the YP in the mid north, and they just grow wheat for a trellis for lentils the next year. So I think the one thing that fixes low prices is low prices. So wheat, I think if you apply inflation, we're at all-time lows in terms of the world price of wheat. So the question is how low do we have to go before Russia and the Black Sea then start hitting the bottom, the bottom of where they're prepared to actually grow wheat as well. And maybe we're at that point now. The challenge for us is longer term. Is wheat as profitable or the best gross margin? Now I had a crop tour with local farmers in our agronomy group on Monday, and I think wheat's probably been the poorest performer in terms of gross margins over the last 10 years. So we've switched into other crops. Canola area's grown. Probably the troubling thing for us is we're not able to use all the tools available to us in our rotation here in South Australia. So like GM canola, and that those options are only going to grow as more research goes into those areas and more varieties are bred for different purposes. So that's our big challenge, I think, is getting the right mix agronomically. I think is probably the best way to start in terms of where your rotational is. You chase rainbows sometimes you'll never catch up. Lentils, I think they're very much here to stay. I mean, we had a record crop last year, International Year of the Pulses. I think we're in probably a new paradigm with pulses out in the Mallee, the northern Mallee. Traditional wall-to-wall wheat has now got a significant amount or portion of pulses in its rotation. So a tight spring will test that. I don't think they've necessarily quite had that yet. So yeah, we'll see. But certainly farmers are adapting to, and following what is a good agronomic fit, but also, gross margins are leading them to look at alternative crops.
Have you seen that in your travels as well, James?
We have. I was on the West Coast last week and speaking to a number of growers, a number of them are back on their full program because, it was, seasonal conditions determined that. But, it wasn't unusual to hear of 20% reduction in their program. Some didn't sow at all. So, that was more around seasonal conditions at the time. Look, generally across Australia, from our research, yes, the Australian crop will be well down in wheat. I think last year we produced 35 million tonnes and we're forecasting 22 nationally. So I think all states will be down, except probably Victoria, who'll probably be up in wheat production. So
a mix of season because it was late and timing, but also just agronomic.
Going to the price point.
Yeah, price
we
point.
go back to April, May when people were planning their rotations, and the outlook for wheat price was pretty soft. So I think there's if they could find some sheep, they would have probably had more sheep than wheat at the moment. So, but in saying that, there's a strong stockpile of wheat globally. There's still opportunity in Australia because at the end of the day, Australia still grows good quality wheat, and that's what the world's probably short in. So you get these shock to seasonal conditions like through America and Canada, and then you'll get this price volatility, which we saw 6 weeks ago, where you could have hedged out to $300 a tonne locally. So there will be opportunities, based around these sort of seasonal shocks, for protein, high protein or high quality wheat, which is what the other big countries like Russia and generally don't grow a lot of. So, there could be opportunities. They might be a short window or small window for those things, but I think it's imperative that the farmers have their marketing plans in place to grab those opportunities. So, wheat did hit $300 a tonne locally there for a period. I know it was in a time where production wasn't assured, but I think farmers have got to be a bit more proactive in looking at their marketing of going forward. So.
With those areas that you say didn't sow at all, have they generally been people with livestock, or is it, it's the same in the mid-north, there was a few people that hadn't sown at all. Are they people that might have been also running livestock, or are they big producers that didn't put in? How big a issue was the not putting crops in at all?
I think it's a bit of a mixed story. There's some 100% croppers who've just cut back on their program. For others who didn't sow, they generally be further west on the Eyre Peninsula, so they're probably more likely to be running a mixed program with sheep and cropping. So yeah.
Same as in the mid-north?
Well, it's mid-north and also probably more so the Eyre Peninsula. And I know that the trade have really struggled to get their head around area sown. That's the first figure that people are putting their supply and demand equations around, is what is the area sown. The strength in the livestock market has meant that people have been quite happy to lay off the production of and not take that production risk when they've got some livestock income to offset that. And there's also the environmental factor of where people have actually sown on these last sort of rains. Particularly on the Eyre Peninsula, we had quite good rains, and that was actually timing of when I was over there, and people were sowing just to get crop cover without a great expectation of actually getting anything on the other side. And so there's an environmental dust risk factor that's in that. Now, if we get a spring, those crops will come through, and so there's that particular bonus. So our production is highly variable right now, and I've seen crops at Port Broughton that are out fully in head, but you've only got one. You haven't got any plant tillering, and the plant's obviously stressed. From right over on the E-Peg, where I've got crops that almost just emerged out of the ground, sort of thing, and
I'd heard reports of someone seeding on York Peninsula last week which is quite funny. So that is more of a ground cover. Is that a viable decision to be still sowing now?
Oh, it's getting very late in the curve. Yeah, and Yorke Peninsula, from what I've seen of the Yorke Peninsula, it's very hard to say, oh, the Yorke Peninsula. You've actually got to sort of look at, say, what's happening at Karamulka is probably the dry area. You've got areas around Maitland that's too wet and other areas that are too dry. And so people will make these decisions largely around if it's wet, they like to sow something. That's sort of one of the first things. But some of that stuff is actually preventing environmental risk, that's their mindset. There's also a lot of cost involved with committing to seeding and tillage equipment into the ground, and for some people they actually haven't incurred that cost, and so their rationale is, well, we'll just sit back. It's all about creating resilience in business, forward planning, and making sure that you've got the finances to get over those things, because our climate is increasingly variable, and so our challenges are, from a production point of view, are going to be increasing in line with that. People just need to manage the variances of it. You can't have a holistic strategy in today's market. You've got to deal with everybody on their location.
Obviously, the weather outlook's a little bit more positive than it was at the start of the year. Do we foresee any barriers, or how do we foresee the rest of the season then planning out, and then maybe even longer term? Is there any thoughts as to what might affect the season looking longer term?
Who's got the crystal ball?
Oh, well, I know that the frost and the frost maps now, and I've had traders emailing me frost maps of WA particularly, and when it's at 8 degrees, and I go, well, just tell me when it's actually -2 degrees and not worry about when it's 8 degrees. So there's an intense focus at the moment, I think, on frost risk. Some of our crops are very early and are quite susceptible to frost risk, particularly in Wade's area. But we have traditional areas that are frosting areas. So we've got frost risk, we've got heat shock risk, and we still need rain, even though now in some areas now we've actually got full profile. So we can't write a crop off in August. It's basically September when the Australian crop is actually made.
It's a bit like football, isn't it? You might have someone that will consider themselves premiers, but that's in May. It's September when the action happens, and everyone says spring rain makes grain. So, but even in some areas, if you are flowering outside of the favourable window, frost wouldn't matter how much rain you get. Frost will be a factor. So that's something that we sort of look at in our business. I think there's actually an element or a percentage that you do want to get frosted, so you can actually, maybe 5 to 10% is good, because it means that you've hit the right timing. But we've got some paddocks that it doesn't matter what we'll do. We'll get frosted every year. We're fortunate those paddocks this year are in barley, which is a little bit more tolerant than wheat, but the time will tell. I think there's forecast 3 frosts this week, so looking over the 28-day, it looks as if there's reasonable sort of showers coming through, whether or not any eventuate to anything significant. If it dries out and then we still get frost, it's going to be an impact. But that's why you mix, you have a rotation mix. So, and I think there is a bit of a swing back into things like livestock. Hay is probably something that's increasing in our area, and then a different mix of pulses. Some are very susceptible to frost, others are better. Canola's probably the one that sometimes we've had frost. Wheat paddock will be wiped out, canola will be fine, then you'll go over the next rise and it'll be the complete opposite. So it's a really big unknown. That's why I think research and is going to be, and science is only going to be the only thing that delivers a solution there. And my concern in South Australia is that we don't have access to to GM technologies, and I think that's with that and CRISPR is what's going to deliver those things.
You don't foresee any other harvest issues leading into harvest, as in, you're from the Mallee yourself. You guys have had a year or so of no rail anymore. Do you guys see prices as going to come back, or?
In terms of the supply chain, look, I think the biggest impact of the Mallee railway line shutting down is that there's increased trucks on the road. Now, people were nervous about the amount of trucks on the road, but then that's actually probably led from the significant yields that we had last year. So we haven't seen an impact in terms of price from the Mallee rail shutting down, because I don't think there was enough volume on there, or that's what they're telling us to warrant it. So it wasn't viable. So that hasn't impact the supply chain costs. So it's just a matter of, right across the state, we have a backlog of maintenance on our roads. So if we see more railway lines shut down, it's just going to exacerbate that issue. So I think that needs to be people's right across the state's focus when we come into the next state election, is what are they going to do with country roads. Now, yes, an election may be won or lost in the inner suburban seats or in the metropolitan Adelaide, but investment in agriculture is good for everyone. And I think roads is something that we really need to see the governments lift their game on. So certainly in terms of the Mallee Highway, we're in desperate need for some overtaking lanes, but there's other roads. I mean, you look at the roads on the York Peninsula and, for the amount of value that those areas are adding to this economy, I don't think we're getting our fair share. So that's probably something that's going. And it's a gradual thing, but at some point in time, it's going to really start costing us. And I wonder whether we're getting close to that point.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing, and one of the observations I'm seeing, and even this morning as I'm coming down, the amount of road traffic and the increase of road traffic, and if we start to see an increase in port facilities that facilitate that sort of road traffic, we're seeing road train activity between Pinaroo and Loxton now on permits. We're seeing a significant increase in road train activity right through the mid-north, which is really the domain of the Eyre Peninsula. And I actually think that's a game changer. I think that is absolutely a supply chain sort of cost, but it doesn't mean that grain necessarily moves in a logical manner, like Pinaroo, Loxton, Truro, Adelaide. Sort of, it's like three sides of a rectangle. So roads and accessibility of roads and changing markets all needs to be thought about in a longer term view, rather than, unfortunately, we often only forecast this stuff on a political cycle, which is incredibly short term.
What about from Rabobank's perspective leading into harvest? Is there things that they're keeping an eye on or concerned about?
Well, clearly the production in the Northern Hemisphere will drive the global supply. The Australian dollar, I mean, we've seen it move from 75 to just touch 80 and drop back a little bit. For every cent movement, around the current bushel price, it's $3.50 a tonne to an Australian wheat grower. So, so that will have an effect. I think the longer term view is that the dollar will probably ease, but no one saw this spike from 75 to 80 cents either. So there's still things that can influence. So I think that again comes back to the grower and how well they look at their marketing. Are they looking to hedge or take basis contracts, or to take into account some of the opportunities it might present if the dollar dropped again. So yeah. And
is there any take-home messages you guys want to put out there for signing off on how this season may be going?
I think probably in my position as chair of GPSA, I would encourage farmers to make sure they are aware of the harvest code. I think it's about managing risks that we've talked a lot about, grain marketing and agronomic risks. I think leading into harvest, planning is key, making sure that you and your staff are safe. And look, if things turn out unfavourable in spring, I'd encourage farmers to seek guidance and help where they need it. Mental health's a big issue, and we've had a run of good seasons, so we need to be mindful that challenging times can create issues. So again, it's about managing those things as much as it is managing the crop in the paddock. So yeah.
It's the underpinning business that will drive strategies. It drives thinking. And so, to a lesser degree, markets. It's what is the business requirement. So, what is business requirements for cash flow? That's a planning issue. What's our HR requirements? So there's a whole gambit of business underpinning principles that need to be constantly monitored as we run into harvest. Legislation's changing very quickly on roads. Make sure you're across this. Make sure you're across your WH&S. Make sure that people are safe. And really work on those sort of sides of the business, because we actually have to be here for a long term.
Next 6 weeks critical. As we run through September from an Australian crop point of view. Still some opportunities there for some price volatility, and that could be a positive for an Australian wheat grower. So, they must get to understand the global markets and supplies change, globally to sort of see if they can, grab one of those opportunities. So,
Beautiful. All right, well, thank you all again for participating, and thank you for watching.